Okay, give me a moment to verify the live stream. Okay. Sergeants, can we please start the recordings?
Cloud has started.
Okay, good morning and welcome to today's remote New York City Council hearing for the Committee on Housing and Buildings. At this time, we ask that all council members and staff please turn on their video for verification purposes. To minimize disruptions throughout the hearings, please place cell phones and electronic devices to vibrate or silent. If you have testimony you wish to submit for the record, you may do so via email at testimony@council.nyc.gov. Once again, that is testimony@council.nyc.gov. We thank you for your cooperation. Chair, we are ready to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Before we get started, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging my colleagues who are here on the line. We have Councilmember Aviles, Councilmember Kagan, Councilmember Carr, Councilmember Caban, Councilmember Barron, Councilmember Felice, Councilmember Dinowitz, and that is who I am seeing for now. So good morning, everyone. I am Councilmember Pierina Sanchez, Chair of the Committee on Housing and Buildings. I want to thank you all for joining today's hearing. Today, the committee will hear an introduction in relation to the continuation of New York City rent stabilization law of 1969 and a resolution determining that a public emergency requiring rent control in the city of New York continues to exist. It is no secret that New York City's housing stock has become increasingly unaffordable and unavailable for some of New York City's most vulnerable populations. Rent regulation is one of the most important tools that the city has had over decades to help New Yorkers be stably housed and to keep housing affordable to those who need it. The results of the 2021 Housing and Vacancy Survey demonstrate the need for the City Council to extend rent regulation. Today, we will interrogate those findings. The survey, which is a snapshot in time and was conducted from February to July 2021, found an overall net vacancy rate of 4.54%, below the 5% threshold for a finding of public emergency necessitating rent regulation. It's important to note that a 4.54% vacancy rate is for all rental types in the city of New York. The vacancy rate varies considerably when you break down the data by borough, by rent affordability level, and whether the housing is unregulated or regulated through a range of programs or under rent stabilization. For example, the vacancy rate in Manhattan was 10.01%, above the citywide vacancy rate, and far above the other boroughs. 4.15% in Queens and Staten Island, 2.73% in Brooklyn, and less than 1% in my own borough, the Bronx, where we have, by the way, built the largest share of new affordable housing units across New York City in the last decade. Less surprisingly still, vacancy rates still vary greatly based on rental amounts. Less than 1% of rents under $1,500 and over 12% for rents above $2,300 and up. The urgency of this situation is underscored by the rent burden experienced by New Yorkers. In 2021, a staggering 53% of renter households were rent burdened, paying over 30% of their household income in rent. That's nearly 1 million households. Of those, almost 600,000 households were severely rent burdened, paying over 50% of their household income in rent. And the median asking rent for all units that were vacant and available for rent was $2,750. Based on affordability and income, most New Yorkers could not afford most of the available units. In fact, the New York City median income would have to double in order for New Yorkers to be able to afford the median rent. And when considering our lowest income households in the city, the HVS has found an extreme vacancy shortage at below 1% for the lowest income households. This is the lowest this rate has been in over 30 years. and it's no surprise to those of us who live with and serve these households every single day. All this data speaks to the severity of the city's housing crisis. Although today's hearing has a specific focus, I want to emphasize how important it is that the New York City Housing Plan look holistically at this information, the city's economic health, and most importantly, the people who stand to be most affected by the decisions that we make as lawmakers. In March, this committee extended the existing rent stabilization law for 3 months, as authorized earlier by New York state law. That extension was simply to account for delays with the HVS caused by COVID-19, which we will discuss today. And today we are looking finally at the findings of the 2021 HVS, which the council received about a month ago. And the purpose of today's hearing is so that the council can determine whether there is an ongoing public emergency. Only through council determination can the rent stabilization law continue to move forward. Based on the data, the answer appears to be yes. The city is still in a housing emergency, and this council has a responsibility in this case to take measures to protect tenants, especially those who are most vulnerable. Yet today, myself and my colleagues will be asking questions of HPD, who receives the survey responses from the Census Bureau, to ensure the integrity of the survey and that we are making the best decision with the best available data and the best available information. Today, the committee will hear from the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, as well as from housing advocates, members of the real estate industry, and other key stakeholders. I would like to thank my colleagues from the Housing and Buildings Committee for joining today. And I'd also like to thank the council staff, Audrey Sun, and policy analysts, as well as my chief of staff, Sam Cardenas, and Kadeem Robinson, my legislative director, for all their help and all their work preparing for this hearing today. With that, Sergeant, can we swear in the administration?
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you. Just before we proceed with the oath, I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping matters for the virtual hearing. My name is Audrey Sun. I'm the counsel to the City Council's Committee on Housing and Buildings. Just a reminder that all participants will be on mute until it is your turn to testify, at which point a member of our staff will prompt you to unmute. Please accept the prompt when you receive it. During the hearing, if council members would like to ask a question, please simply use the Zoom raise hand function and we will call on you in turn. And in the interest of time, council member questions will be set to 5 minutes each. We will first hear from the administration and followed by council member questions. And then after that, we will take testimony from members of the public. I will now administer the oath. Today, the Department of Housing Preservation and Development is represented by Deputy Commissioner Brendan McLaughlin, Chief Research Officer Elizabeth Gomer, and Assistant Commissioner Lucy Jaffe. Please raise your right hands. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee and to respond honestly to council member questions? Brendan McLaughlin?
I do.
Elizabeth Gomer?
I do.
Lucy Jaffe?
I do.
Thank you. You may begin when ready.
Well, thank you very much, Audrey, and good morning, Chair Sanchez and members of the Housing and Building Committee. I am Brendan McLaughlin, Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Strategy at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. I am joined by my colleagues, Dr. Elizabeth Gomer, HPD's Chief Research Officer, and Lucy Jaffe, Assistant Commissioner for Housing Policy. I would like to thank the committee for welcoming us today to testify in support of Preconsidered Resolution T 2022-1530 and Preconsidered Introduction T 2022-1528, and to discuss initial findings from the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, the Nycc HVS. HPD submitted the findings to the Council on May 16, 2022. The Nycc HVS provides critical data that informs our understanding of the city's housing stock and establishes the city's net rental vacancy rate, which the Council must consider when determining if New York City is in a state of housing emergency. Pursuant to state law, a housing emergency is determined based on the supply and condition of housing accommodations within a municipality and an identified need for regulating and controlling residential rents. The continuation of rent stabilization and rent control in the city depends on a determination by the council that a state of housing emergency still exists. Local law also requires that a survey be conducted to examine the supply of housing, the condition of housing, and the need for continuing regulation and control of residential rents and evictions. The Nycc HVS is a representative survey of the city's housing stock and has been carried out about every 3 years since 1965. It is the longest running housing survey in the country and is of critical importance for understanding how our city is changing and what we can and should do to support improvements in policy and programming. It is conducted by the United States Census Bureau under contract with the City of New York. Interviews for the current survey were conducted between February and June of 2021, making it the most up-to-date representative data on New York City currently available. As you know, the council must pass the resolution and introduction being heard here today between 30 and 60 days from receiving findings of the Nycc HVS, and the mayor must sign the legislation before July 1st, 2022. Simply put, they are what make the extension of the rent control and rent stabilization laws possible. In 2021, the Nycc HVS underwent a major redesign and added a new module focused on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The redesign focused on 5 key areas: improving the validity of how the Nycc HVS measures key features of the city's housing stock and population, ensuring the Nycc HVS sample is able to adequately speak to all of New York City's various types of housing and represent the population living in different types of units, modernizing procedures and protocols, employing new technology and reducing the burdens placed on respondents and field workers, ensuring representation among hard-to-reach communities through enhanced language access and inclusive respondent-facing materials and messaging, and lastly, expanding the survey questionnaire on important topics, including financial stability. In addition, through the new COVID-19 module, the Nycc HVS collected information about New Yorkers' experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic, including its disparate impact by various socio-demographic groups, protected characteristics, and housing conditions. While much of the city's pandemic response is oriented to the urgency of how we can help New Yorkers who are at risk now, the Nycc HVS is one of the tools we have to help us better plan for the future. The findings from this module show the intense strain that many New Yorkers, particularly the lowest income New Yorkers, faced during the first 18 months of the pandemic. 1 in 10 renter households faced food insecurity. 1 in 8 renter households reported missing at least 1 rent payment. And of these, just under 30% reported still being in arrears at the time of the survey. As Dr. Gomer's testimony will highlight in detail, the findings from the 2021 Nycc HVS are clear. New York City continues to face a housing crisis that affects our residents in various ways, from paying too much of their income toward rent each month, to feeling stuck because of the lack of vacant affordable apartments, to facing pests, mold, and heat outages in their homes. Despite the city's unparalleled investments in creating and preserving affordable housing, the continued shortage of housing options contribute to the ongoing affordability and homelessness crisis. More than half of New York renters were rent burdened, which means they are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent, which is consistent with the highest levels on record over the past decade. Within our housing crisis, long-standing renter protections from the rent control and rent stabilization laws have been vital resources for millions of households over the years. In 2021, approximately 1 million New York City households benefited from the protection of these laws. Rent stabilization in particular provides the largest source of low-cost housing in the city and offers critical tenant protections that enable residents to remain in their homes and exercise the choice to stay in their neighborhoods. Rent stabilization also supports our affordable housing work, where HPD adds to the stock of rent-stabilized housing through many of our housing programs, which provides an extra layer of protection for those renters. Taking these and many other findings into consideration, we believe New York City continues to experience a housing crisis. The shortage of housing is particularly acute for lower income households who face the lowest vacancy rates and a shrinking stock of lower cost units. It is clear from the 2021 Nycc HVS that we must not only continue to add to the overall stock to address our emergency, but specifically add lower cost units and work to retain existing units with low rents to support New Yorkers who face continued affordability challenges. Before turning the microphone over to the Chief Research Officer, I want to emphasize my gratitude to Liz and the entire team that ran the New York City HVS through truly trying circumstances over the past 3 years. Also to the hundreds of New Yorkers who worked as census field representatives, and of course, the thousands of New Yorkers who dedicated their time and shared their personal information. The people of the city of New York, and especially the million households who live in rent-controlled and rent-stabilized housing, are deeply indebted to their service. I'll turn it over now to the Chief Research Officer, Elizabeth Gomer.
Thank you so much, Brendan. I just want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Councilmember Felice, Chief Research Officer.
Thank you and good morning. I am Elizabeth Gomer, Chief Research Officer at HPD. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before Council today. I'm going to share my screen and present some slides. Let me do that. And if you could just confirm that you can see it. Can you all see that okay? Great.
Yes.
Thank you. HPD submitted selected initial findings from the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey to the Council on May 16th, 2022. Our testimony today will present the main findings from the report, including key statistics on the supply of housing, its condition, and the continued need for the regulation of residential rents and evictions. As with past cycles of the NYC HVS, more detailed analysis will be made available over the coming weeks and months, and the Census Bureau plans to release the microdata from the 2021 NYC HVS later this summer for analysis by a range of policymakers, researchers, and academics who rely on the NYC HVS for their work. The United States Census Bureau conducted the survey from February through the middle of July in 2021. Although the NYC HVS is the most up-to-date representative information we currently have available, it is important to note that it reflects this point in time. The estimates we share today, as well as the information provided in the report, are based on that time period. In 2021, there were 3.644 million housing units in New York City. This is the largest stock recorded since the NYC HVS began in 1965 and represents a net increase of 175,000 units since 2017. The 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey reports the net rental vacancy rate to be 4.54%, below the 5% net rental vacancy rate threshold set forth in state and local laws as the condition determining that a housing emergency continues to exist. The citywide net rental vacancy rate indicates that although supply has continued to increase, it has failed to keep pace with the continuing demand for housing. When we break the vacancy rate down further, we see significant variation in the rental inventory. Manhattan had a significantly higher net rental vacancy rate than any other borough at 10%. The net rental vacancy rate was 4.15% for Queens and Staten Island combined, 2.73% in Brooklyn, and less than 1% in the Bronx. There was an acute shortage of housing among lower cost units. In 2021, the median rent of all occupied housing was $1,500. The vacancy rate for units with asking rents below this level was less than 1%. Units with asking rents at or above $2,300 had a 12.64% vacancy rate. In 2021, there were 353,000 units that were vacant but not available for one or more reason. Of those that were unavailable for only one reason, a total of 244,000 units, by far the most prevalent reason for being unavailable was what we call held for seasonal, recreational, or occasional use, with 103,000 units in this group. In 2021, there were 2.274 million renter occupied and vacant available rental units during the survey period. Just over 1 million of these were rent stabilized, representing 42% of the active rental stock. This is statistically the same as it was in 2017. There was a similar share of rental units that were what the NYC HVS refers to as private unregulated units. These units are commonly referred to as market rate because their rents are not regulated. These include units in newer buildings that were not subject to rent stabilization as a result of participation in an affordable housing or tax incentive program, units in smaller buildings where rent stabilization did not apply, and units that were previously decontrolled and not subject to rent stabilization by some other means. These private unregulated rental units also generally included units in condominium and cooperative buildings that were renter occupied or available for rent, either as a sponsored unit after construction or conversion, or as a sublet by the unit's owner. Each cycle of the NYCHVS shows the net change in units from the prior survey. That is the cumulative result of both the units that have left the stock and those that have been added. Over time, the NYCHVS has shown minimal net change in the rent stabilized stock and a net increase of private unregulated units. The NYCHVS measured housing conditions through self-report of the current occupants regarding maintenance deficiencies, as it has done for many cycles. In 2021, 14% of occupied rental units reported 3 or more maintenance deficiencies. Although the share of households experiencing a heating or toilet breakdown decreased in 2021, there was an increase in the prevalence of most individual deficiencies, including the presence of rodents, leaks, cracks and holes, broken plaster or peeling paint, and additional heating required. This upward trend was across all housing types, but we saw significant disparities in the tenant population living with these conditions. New Yorkers of color, and particularly Black and Hispanic New Yorkers, were much more likely to experience lower quality housing than white New Yorkers. Overall, 8% of all New York City households were living in overcrowded conditions in 2021. 12% of foreign-born households were crowded, and the prevalence was highest for families with children, where 1 in 4 households were crowded. The 2021 NYCHVS showed that we continue to face a severe affordability challenge. According to the 2021 NYCHVS, the median household income for renters was $50,000. That's equivalent to a gross monthly income of $4,167. Using standard federal guidelines that suggest a household should pay no more than 30% of gross income on housing costs, the typical renter household could afford to pay $1,250 in rent and utilities. But the median contract rent in 2021 was $1,500. And it was $1,650 when we factor in the cost of utilities, which are also high. Moreover, the median asking rent of units available for rent was $2,750, well above the $1,250 the typical household could afford to pay. To be able to afford the typical unit available for rent would require a household income of at least $110,000 a year, more than double that of the typical New York City renter. What results is a high prevalence of rent burden across nearly every income level. In 2021, we found that more than half of renter households were rent burdened or paying more than 30% of income for housing each month. More than a third were severely burdened or paying more than 50% of income for housing. The NYCHVS helps us identify the components of this challenge. One side is rent burden based on the intersection of housing costs and incomes. But another critical component is the overall composition of our rental stock. Between 2017 and 2021, we saw a net decrease of about 96,000 units renting for less than $1,500 and a net increase of 107,000 units renting for $2,300 or more. And that's all reported in 2021 dollars after adjusting for inflation. This is not a recent phenomenon. Over the last decade, from 2011 to 2021, we saw an even larger net loss of the lowest cost units as rent shifted upward. The graph here shows the net change in the number of rental units by rent level in 2021 relative to 2011 after adjusting for inflation. The negative bars to the left show where we have lost lower cost units, and the bars to the right show the net increase in higher cost units. Over this time period, the last decade, there was a net increase of about 340,000 units with rents below $1,500, and a net increase of just over 335,000 units with rents of $2,300 or more. When we examine the change in rents over the last 30 years, we see a dramatic shift in rental costs after adjusting for inflation. This graph shows the absolute number of units with rents of less than $1,500 and those with rents of $2,300 or more from 1991 to 2021 for each cycle of the NYC HVS. Over this period, New York City saw a loss of almost 610,000 units renting for less than $1,500 and a gain of 430,000 more units renting for $2,300 or more. All of these estimates are inflation adjusted and shown in 2021 dollars. The affordability challenge faced by everyday New Yorkers continues unabated. When we examine the share of income spent on rent for the typical New Yorker, all the way back to the first NYC HVS in 1965, we see a clear increase over time. In the last decade, the level of rent burden has remained constant, where the typical New Yorker, regardless of income, is paying more than 30% of pre-tax income on rent. As Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin shared earlier in our testimony, New York renters struggled financially during the first year and a half into the pandemic. The NYC HVS showed that households that were rent burdened had lower confidence that they could cover an emergency expense. They were also more likely to have missed at least one rent payment and to still be in arrears at the time of the survey, placing them at risk of losing their home or forgoing other critical expenses to make ends meet. In summary, there is a net rental vacancy rate of less than 5% overall and a severe shortage of lower cost units. Rents continue to increase. The rent burden faced by most New York households remains at persistently high levels, leaving households vulnerable to financial instability across multiple dimensions. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Liz and Brendan. Appreciate the testimony. So I'm going to start off asking some questions, and then I want to turn it over to colleagues before I come back, just to be respectful of everyone's time. I want to make sure they can have their questions asked. So the results are dismal, especially for the lowest income New Yorkers. There's just a lot in here. There's actually some sad music playing in my office, and it was just very resonant with some of the findings here. But as I mentioned in my introduction, the purpose of this hearing really is to talk about these findings for the council to be able to make a determination about whether the extension of rent stabilization is warranted, whether there is a 5%. And so I want to make sure to do that before I certainly go into questions about affordability and things like that. So first, I'm going to start the focus on methodology, and starting off specifically with the extension. So in typical years, the question is going to be, can you walk us through what a typical non-COVID-19, non-census year would have been like? What would that timing have been like? And how does that compare to this timing? Why did you need an extension from the city council and from the state?
Of course, thank you. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this incredibly important survey effort and our partnership with the Census Bureau to conduct this in the most rigorous and valid of means. So in a typical year, we would conduct the NYC HVS every 3 years. And in the third year of that cycle, within a year of completing fieldwork, we would prepare our selected initial findings, deliver those to the council, generally in early February, allowing 30 to 60 days for the council to make its determination. And if it's so voted, then to extend rent control and rent stabilization by the usual deadline of April 1st of that year. Every 30 or so years, our triennial cycle falls at the beginning of a decade when the US Census Bureau is mandated by the Constitution to conduct the decennial census. Sometimes we just call that the census. And that means that they are obviously, their prime focus is on conducting that across the country following that mandate and getting those results out for all of the various purposes it's used for. And we in New York City, of course, support every effort to make sure that that count is accurate and completed in a timely manner. The downside for the NYC HVS is that it means that the census is really laser focused on that decennial operation and is unable to conduct a sort of secondary survey like the NYC HVS at the same time. We on the New York City side, honestly, would never want those two surveys to be done at the same time because we would not want any New Yorker to be confused about which of those they are participating in. And we want to make sure that the messaging for both surveys is very clear. So as has been done in the past, when we are scheduled to be, our triennial cycle is to fall in the beginning of a decade, we need to be able to adjust our timeline. And so before COVID-19 hit, we had made the decision and worked with all of you at both the local as well as our state partners to be able to gain a year's extension and push the NYC HVS from occurring in early 2020 to occurring in early 2021. We then, of course, faced the pandemic, the beginning of the pandemic while we were gearing up for the 2021 NYC HVS, and then needed to conduct fieldwork approximately 12 months after the beginning of the pandemic during the winter of 2021 and into the spring when conditions were still quite dire. The NYC HVS has historically been an in-person survey. For many reasons, it is vital that we be as consistent as we can be with that mode of data collection to ensure the integrity of the data and the completeness and coverage, particularly for low-income households that may be less likely to respond by phone or internet or any other mode. But of course, we also had to make a fairly dramatic shift in some of our procedures to protect the health and safety of both the public as well as our field staff working out of the US Census Bureau. And it was frankly challenging to staff up with field staff who were willing to do that very important work for us, to get them trained, to set up those public health procedures and make sure that all of those were ready to go, to ensure the health and safety of everyone involved. And that resulted in the need for an additional 3-month delay to be able to conduct all of the necessary field work, which completed by the middle of July in 2021.
Thank you so much. And so, okay, so recognizing the 1-year extension or the 1-year push is typical, it happens every 30 years, but recognizing that COVID-19 caused additional delays, can you just for clarification's sake, the purpose of the additional 3 months was for data collection, expanding the period of time the data was collected, or was it for analysis or for both?
Of course, it was purely for data collection. Importantly, although we needed that additional time to complete data collection, the actual time period in which we were collecting surveys remained the same. We were originally scheduled to start data collection at the very end of 2020 and to really sort of hit the ground running in late December and into the beginning of January. We did launch fieldwork in February, but we're continuing to still staff up and scale our efforts, and really only started working in earnest at the beginning of early March, where we were really getting a volume of cases. And so we needed the additional 3 months to be able to maintain the time that is necessary to work each one of our sampled cases, make sure we have adequate response rates, and that we're truly representative of not only every type of housing unit, but also all of our communities of New Yorkers that we try to interview.
Thank you. Thank you. And there have been criticisms certainly lodged at the administration about whether the city actually made this extension or required this extension, requested this extension in order to beef up the numbers, right? In order to get higher rates of responses. So can you walk us through how does HPD and the census, how do you decide on a sample size, on the number of folks that you're going to be surveying? And was there any difference in the response rate this year versus previous years? Is any of that attributed to the extra time that we had to collect?
Sure. So first of all, let me say clearly, absolutely not. That the extension was to ensure that we could conduct this in the most rigorous way possible, ensure the highest quality data for all of you and your colleagues to make this very important set of decisions, and to provide a robust set of information that we can use in the coming months and even years to guide important policymaking and programmatic decisions. So that said, let me take a step back and sort of walk you through some of the basic design of the 2021 NYC HVS. So first of all, as I think we explained in the report, and as Deputy Commissioner McLaughlin explained in his first testimony, the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, it represents for us a really important set of modernizations and improvements that we planned even before the pandemic. This was a multi-year process engaging a range of stakeholders, particularly a wide range of our users out there in both government and in academic research, to be able to ensure that the NYC HVS was using the best practices in survey methodology, that it reflected our current city in which we live, and that we were gathering data that would not only help us to make determinations such as the one before you today, but also that it could be used by a range of researchers to help ensure and guide our city to be stronger in the future. So that included at the beginning of this decade, as we usually do in the NYC HVS, redesigning our sample from the ground up, drawing a new set of addresses that we will continue to seek to interview for each NYC HVS for the rest of this decade. And so this is the first time that we have interviewed those households. But obviously the New York City housing stock evolves over time. And so just drawing a random sampling of addresses is not sufficient to make sure that we have sufficient power, statistical power, and coverage for all of the different communities and different types of housing that we need and want to speak to. So we work in collaboration with the United States Census Bureau to supplement their master address files with various administrative records from New York City on different types of housing. We are in partnership with HCR at the state level, so we also mix in rent registration information for rent stabilized units, tax information, tax abatement information, HPD's production, et cetera, to make sure that that is all part of the design of our sample that we will have for the rest of this decade. For the 2021 NYC HVS, we initially drew a sample of 30,000 housing units, which had been our intention to continue with the rest of this decade. Due to the pandemic, you can imagine that not only were we in a difficult financial situation, right, where we were all asked to do what we could to reduce the fiscal impact of the pandemic in those early months, but we also recognized that being an in-person survey would necessitate changes to our on-the-ground operation, particularly all of the public health protocols that we put in place. And so as a result, we worked with the sample methodologist at Census to draw a subsample of 12,000 housing units, which comprises the sample for the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey. Our overall final response rate was 73.3%, which was very high, particularly for an in-person effort during the first year of the pandemic. All of that was based on pre-analysis by our Census Bureau statisticians to ensure that we would have adequate power and number of completed cases based on those projections to ensure that we could report on the kinds of things that we did in the selected initial findings. And almost across the board, we hit or exceeded all of those targets of completed cases that we would need to be able to generate valid and appropriately precise estimates.
Thank you, thank you. And how does that response rate compare to previous HVSs?
Sure, so we did have a lower response rate for 21 than in the past. In 2017, our final response rate was just over 80%. And this time, as I said, it was 73.3%. But I will say that as in 2017, the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey response rate reflects real interviews, complete interviews, interviews that were done with all of the level of respect for the respondents who gave their time willingly to participate and for the information that they shared. Part of our redesign for 2021 was to fairly dramatically expand the number of questions that we asked. In 2017 and earlier, our average interview for a New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey was just over 10 minutes. The 2021 NYC HVS, including the questions we asked about COVID and the pandemic, averaged just under 40 minutes. So you can imagine that part of that lower response rate is just a natural extension of asking for more time, which, as you know, and as we all know, is the most precious thing that any New Yorker can give us.
First of all, shout out to New Yorkers who gave 40 minutes for this survey. That is impressive for New Yorkers. That's great. But it all sounds to me, and I'm sure many of my colleagues would agree, the methodology is robust, right? We're talking about the Census Bureau. We're talking about a preset, a predetermined and sort of scientifically determined sample size and sample that is sort of checked across many different data sources with the city of New York and anything that it sounds like anything HPD and the city had available. And yet there was still a low response rate, sort of, to me, I'm just sort of saying this out loud and thinking out loud, to me saying that, no, this wasn't an effort to do anything but have a robust methodology and make sure that the HVS was sound. That's certainly what I'm hearing. So thank you for clarifying that. And so just want to give you the opportunity, if there are any other statistical quality standards or disclosure avoidance practices that you want to highlight, want to make sure to give you that opportunity.
Sure, thank you. I always appreciate additional time to talk about our statistical methodology. I promise I won't take up too much of the time here. Just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight about the 21 NYC HVS in particular. And the NYC HVS, I would say actually in general, right? We have been conducting this survey in partnership with the Census Bureau for more than 50 years now. And it is always a balance between maintaining that legacy and the time series and integrity of being able to look at these very long trends over time, some of which we have highlighted today in our testimony and we highlighted in our report. To be able to look at data going all the way back to the 60s is an incredibly unusual gift and a privilege to be able to have access to those kinds of data. Only New York City has this kind of a survey. So that said, we always try with each and every successive cycle to improve what we are doing, to stay on top of current conditions, to anticipate where we will need data, and to ensure that we really are putting equity and respect of our population at the center of our survey efforts, really from tip to tail. And that we have worked hard with the Census Bureau to ensure that that really is part of our general ethos and really part of our mission and guiding principles. So we have dramatically expanded language access in a variety of ways for the 21 NYC HVS, and we'll continue to expand that into the future. We're really pioneering that with the Census Bureau and have really pushed those boundaries, and we're very proud of our work on that. And have seen a difference in the quality of our data, ensuring that every New Yorker who wants to participate can. We also, of course, and many of the researchers maybe who will see this transcript or joining us today know that we are increasingly in an environment where we have to take data privacy and take extra cautionary steps to ensure the privacy and confidentiality of those wonderful New Yorkers who did give us their time. And the Census Bureau's disclosure avoidance policies have become much stricter over time. And those obviously, part of why we partner with the Census Bureau is because we can benefit from those strict federal guidelines. But it does mean that we have had to produce our selected initial findings in a slightly different process than in past years. It does mean that we are using a much more rigorous process to review and submit those findings to the Census Bureau and have the Census Bureau themselves, when they're producing data for us, go through extra checks and balances. And it means that in the coming months, we may have to release data in a slightly different way than we have in the past. But I just wanted to be able to say on the record that we are doing that because confidentiality and privacy really is our number one priority, balanced, of course, with making sure that our data are the most useful both to us and to all of you as possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And one concept that you mentioned a couple of times, you're making me dig back into my grad school courses, but you talked about statistical power. And I think Professor Watson and Professor Vogel are going to be very proud of me if I get this right. But statistical power refers to just having had a big enough sample size to really have valid results. Can you actually share with us what that means?
You actually explained that very well. I'm sure your professors will be very proud. So yes, I mean, that is intuitively the idea, is that we have enough cases to be able to speak to whatever the measurement is that we are creating from the data. Part of that is an overall sample size, right? That it has enough completed cases for us to create these estimates, to calculate these estimates. But it also is about having sufficient cases in all of the different ways we want to cut the data. So to have enough rent stabilized units in our sample versus private unregulated, or to have enough cases that have lower rents compared to higher rents so that we can draw those comparisons and understand with a sufficient level of precision, accounting for both sampling and non-sampling error, that those are either the same or different estimates. So we run all of our data and all of the work in our selected initial findings report through a variety of different kinds of statistical standards. You'll see, unlike prior selected initial findings, all of our estimates are presented with margins of error and some other kind of technical information for users who want to understand that, to be able to have true transparency of how precise our estimates are, and obviously to show that we do have sufficient power to be able to draw the conclusions that we did to present to all of you here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So those are some of the major sort of methodology questions that I had. But sort of turning to the findings of 4.54 vacancy rate with high variability across borough and across several categories, you know, especially as I highlighted in my introduction, the lowest income New Yorkers are suffering the most, right? In the Bronx, 0.78% vacancy rate for the least, for the lowest cost units. We have, sorry, New York City sounds, everybody can enjoy them. But for the lowest cost units, we're seeing an also below 1% vacancy rate. So turning to sort of, you know, the housing plan, much anticipated. The commissioner talked about it at our executive budget hearing. The administration has been saying for a while that the housing plan is coming. You know, we are in crisis. We still have a below 5% vacancy rate. So folks are feeling that. And as we know, and know too intimately and too painfully, those who are suffering the most are those who have the least, right? And the government seems to completely, you know, continue to disinvest in those, or not invest enough, I should say. So can you, from the policy perspective, sort of moving forward, can you tell us a little bit about how the administration is thinking about tackling this crisis, this specific need that the lowest income New Yorkers, the poorest people in the city of New York, who are also making our city vibrant, because my community is amazing. But what is the administration willing to do here?
Am I unmuted? Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question, Chair. And as you noted, our housing plan is in the works and is forthcoming soon. So we hope to be able to share that with you all soon. But I think what the findings that you've seen in the selected initial findings really points to, as you mentioned, really a disparity in the city in terms of the impact on low-cost housing and the impact that has on low-income New Yorkers. And so certainly over the last several years, we have increased our focus on producing through our development programs and preservation and new construction to serving the very low and extremely low income population of New York City. If you look back over sort of 8 years, around 45% or so of our production has been geared towards that. And that is amped up over, as you sort of look on an annual basis, and in fiscal year 21, that is around roughly 60% or so of our production. When you think about what, low income sort of going up to the, a higher but still low income population, around 85% of our production in 2021 has been focused on folks that are low income. And so that is certainly a priority for us. It will continue to be a priority for us, as well as ensuring that there are tenant resources available beyond, the units that we produce. And so wanting to make sure that folks are able to, we've talked a lot about, and I think our commissioners talked in front of this group before around putting people over process and making sure that people are able to access the resources in a more efficient and quick manner without sort of going through some of the trauma of kind of, recertifying and sort of resubmitting paperwork. And so those are things that we are committed to both at HPD and seemingly certainly across, our partner agencies as well.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. And what percentage of New Yorkers are earning below a 30% area median income, and how much of housing production subsidized by the City of New York has been geared toward folks earning less than 30% area median income?
Sure. I think over the course of the last 8 years or so, around just under 20% of our production has been focused on extremely low income. So that's, as you mentioned, 30% AMI or below. That is also inclusive of, a lot of the work that we do in partnership with some of our other agencies in terms of homeless placements. And in fiscal year 21, sort of a record level of around 2,800 placements, which is, north of 10 or 12% of our overall production was homeless placements. And so again, very committed to sort of making sure that we continue that work and make sure that we continue to serve those more deeply affordable, continue to provide those more deeply affordable units and serve those lower income households.
Thank you. And what percentage of New Yorkers are earning below 30% AMI?
I don't have that. Do we, Liz,
Sorry.
do we have that from our, yeah.
Hi, so I do not have that immediately handy. We didn't report anything in increments of AMI in our report, but I'm happy to follow up and give you the distribution based on the 21 income limits from HUD.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to take a pause here and see if any of my colleagues would like to jump in or have any burning questions. I'll give it a few moments before I hop back in.
Sorry, apologies. I will say while we're letting others gather themselves, quick stat on that is that it's about just over a quarter of households are below 30% of AMI.
Thank you. See the HPD network there. Thank you. Okay, so turning back a little bit, just in terms of the New York State rent stabilization statute, if HPD and the census did not find a vacancy rate of below 5% this year, what would happen in future years? Is there still another analysis that takes place in 3 years, or how would that work?
I think Assistant Commissioner Jaffe is trying to, or
Yes.
oh, there she is, okay.
Sorry. Thank you for unmuting me. So the statute lays out various processes for what should happen. We're not in a great position to provide legal guidance or prediction about exactly how such a process would play out ultimately. But we would certainly follow the statute and the guidance of everyone involved. But we're really focused here today on the fact that we did meet that threshold condition, which is that the vacancy rate is below 5%. And so therefore we actually won't get to that circumstance in which we would have to figure out what might happen. But what we do know is that a 5% vacancy rate is a threshold condition for rent stabilization to continue. So since we've met that threshold, the sort of burden moves back to the council to make a determination as to whether or not a housing emergency exists. And that's the part that of the process we're in today.
Got it. It's never happened before and we haven't thought about it yet, is what I'm hearing. Okay. And so one of the other questions that I've received from advocates and from folks in industry has been about the definition of vacancy. And actually one of the most striking findings, in addition to the burden for the lowest income New Yorkers, was that those units that are not available because they're seasonally, I don't know, so someone is holding them essentially. So how is vacancy defined and how does the census treat these units that, don't have someone living in them, but are, it's somebody's second home or somebody's something, right? How is the census treating them?
Sure. So thank you for that. So let me sort of walk through this in a couple of pieces. So first, let's talk about what the net rental vacancy rate is and what's included in it. So the net rental vacancy rate is a calculation of the portion of the rental stock that is vacant and available for rent, such that it is ready for occupancy at the time we make that determination, or that the U.S. Census Bureau field representative makes that determination for that given unit. So that itself, you can imagine, is very different than just a gross count of units that are not occupied, but do not meet that definition of being able to be rented and moved into at a point in time. And so anything that doesn't meet that definition goes into what we call vacant and not available. And it's important to note that includes both units that are not available for rent, as well as units that are not available for sale, right? The NYCC HVS covers the entire housing supply, not only rental units, although of course that's the majority of our supply and also our primary focus in the NYCC HVS. So within that group of units that we call vacant and not available, there's a whole range of different units and different types of reasons. And it's an important part of the way that we approach our vacancy rate calculation, because the purpose of it is really to determine the inventory that is accessible to New Yorkers who need a home, and to understand those market conditions when we're conducting the survey. So the largest reason that we have for a unit not being available is what we call seasonal, occasional, recreational use. That in and of itself actually includes many different situations. It includes units that are maintained as second homes, right? Where somebody's usual residence is somewhere else. It also, in some cases, includes short-term rentals that are also not available for somebody to live in, to rent and live in as their home. And so units that are rented as an entire apartment and not available for somebody to sign, for example, a long-term lease, also could be classified in that same grouping. It's important to note that as we've done this for many decades, and as we go back to those same units and re-interview them in later cycles of the decade, as we are actually gearing up to do in 2023 for the next NYCC HVS, we see that most of these units, historically, we've seen most of these units that are not available in one survey. When we go back, they've in fact fairly quickly returned to the active inventory, either being available for rent or having become occupied since the prior survey. And some of the reasons that a unit may not be available are pretty intuitive in that way. So for example, people who have signed a lease for an apartment but have not yet moved in. If we go there and it is vacant, we certainly wouldn't want that to be counted as part of the net rental vacancy rate, because nobody else could rent that unit or could purchase that unit, right, if it's in contract, for example. Another important category that we've seen sort of ebb and flow over time is the number of units that are being renovated or awaiting things like building permits to be renovated. In some of those cases, the unit is stripped to the studs, right? Or it doesn't have any appliances or doesn't have a functioning bathroom. So those are also reasons that a unit may not be available. And over time, the number of, the particular reasons and the number of them has evolved as New York City has evolved. But we now have 16 reasons. And for the first time in 2021, we also classified units that met 2 or more of those different reasons, because obviously this list is not mutually exclusive.
Got it. That makes sense. And for those units that are seasonal, occasional, recreational use is the reason they're not available, where in the city are we seeing that the most?
So that's a great question. We have only cut some of our data by borough, but have yet to dig into it on a more granular level. The selected initial findings are just that. They are the initial findings. And so this is all a fresh batch of data that we're working through. And certainly we'll be turning to look at more granular geographic information in the coming weeks and months.
Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you. Look forward to that. Turning to some of the findings around affordability, one of the things that you mentioned in your highlights was that a pretty consistent share of New Yorkers have been rent burdened over the last years. And yet it doesn't feel that way. And there's some other statistics that you highlighted that sort of, I think, speak to why it doesn't feel that way, certainly not in the Bronx and certain parts of the city. But just to kind of drill down on some of those, you mentioned that 13% of renter households were missing a rent payment in the last year. Do you have how that compares to previous years?
So thank you. Unfortunately, we do not. We, as we talked about earlier, dramatically expanded the types and substance of the questions we asked, and added many questions about these different kinds of financial well-being and delay of rent payments. We've also added eviction questions to be able to track those changes over time. Unfortunately, all of those are questions that are brand new to the NYC HVS. And we obviously recognize their incredible value in understanding what's happening now and also tracking change and disparities over time. So unfortunately, we can only speak to what we were able to collect during this first 18 months of the pandemic as a baseline.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. What about in terms of the statistics that says that the lowest income renters are seeing the lowest vacancy rates as well, that rate of lower than 1%? Is that something that we've tracked over time or was new to this survey?
Yes, we have all of that information. We certainly can share that over time. But we have seen in 2021, and I think we sort of reported it in this way, that while we have always seen very, very low vacancy rates, generally less than 1 or 1% for units renting for less than $1,000, and that has been pretty consistent for at least as long as I have been working on the HVS. This is my 5th time testifying before the council. So in my memory, at least, it has always been historically very, very, very low. As we all know, those are largely public housing units and the lowest income group. And so of course it makes sense that we would have very, very low vacancy rate. If I'm remembering this correctly, in 2017, it was 2% for that. And if we think about overall all units under 1,500, it was only slightly higher than that. But I will say, in this 2021 NYC HVS, you can see that for really the first time in many, many, many cycles of the HVS, that units that are renting from 900 to 1,500, that sort of second tier of rents, and just below the median, but those are really the units that are out there available in the market for everyday New Yorkers to apply for, to move to. That is severely and substantially lower than it has been in the past. And that really is a newly emergent phenomenon that unfortunately it's too early to say if that's a short-term result of the pandemic or if that will actually be a more systemic shift in our housing market overall.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good and important question that we should monitor. But I also think we should, especially as the HPD puts out the housing plan, we should look at that in comparison to, different interventions that the city has made over time, and how those interventions have changed the amount of affordable housing available, or the vacancy rate for these lower income units, or lower cost units over time. That would be really important. Okay. So my next question here. So yeah, just if you could repeat one more time, just about what we're seeing with respect to vacancy rates at different income levels. So we've talked a lot about low income or low rental cost units and the low vacancy rates there, but how what do those rates look like, and what do those trends look like for the higher rent price apartments?
Sure. So as we reported and shared today, rental units in the top quartile, so renting for 2,300 or higher, was 12.64% in the 21 survey. In 2017, that was about 8%. And so we do see a significantly higher vacancy rate among those highest cost units.
Great. Gotcha, thank you. And I may have asked this question in a different way, but just to do it again, for Manhattan, we're seeing a vacancy rate of over 10%. So what are the factors that we believe are driving that?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, some of the borough variation, Manhattan at the high end and the Bronx at the lowest end, is partly just about the type of housing that tends to be in those boroughs. So we tend to see lower cost units, as well as means tested housing and other forms of government assisted housing concentrated in the Bronx. In Manhattan, we tend to have more private unregulated units, and the rents for those units tend to be higher. And as we just talked about, the vacancy rate for higher cost units does tend to be on the higher side, particularly for 2021. The other factor is that we see that in condos and cooperatives, there are also higher vacancy rates, net rental vacancy rates. And that may seem counterintuitive to talk about rentals and rental vacancy in condos and co-ops, but that is a really substantial portion of our rental stock in New York City. And we saw over a 7% vacancy rate in condos and co-ops. So that's units that are available for rent on the market, divided by, just as we do all of our vacancy rate calculations, divided by those same units that are available for rent and renter occupied. And to have that be a significantly high vacancy rate also is part of what we believe is driving that Manhattan rate a little bit higher.
Interesting. So it's sort of a similar finding to, other kinds of analyses that we do in terms of tenanting affordable units that are affordable at higher, affordable to the higher income levels. There just isn't as much of a shortage for those private or those unregulated units, right? Mm-hmm. Those higher cost units. What is the vacancy rate for units that are renting at over, say, $2,500 a month?
So I don't have that in more granular level on me right now, but we can certainly follow up and provide to make sure that we're meeting those statistical standards. We can vet that with the Census Bureau and see what more granular information we could provide to you and to the council.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's just important to keep talking about what it is. We are in housing crisis, we are in a housing emergency, but what is it that we're underproducing? I think it's really important to continue to highlight that and address that and fight to make that better with our policy changes. Okay, so do we have a sense of the severely rent burdened New Yorkers, those paying more than 50% of their income on rent? Where in the city, I imagine the Bronx, I know the Bronx, but where in the city are those renters located, and what steps is the city taking to help those at this point in time?
Sure. So I can speak to the first part of that and defer to my colleagues on the latter part. As I said before, this is only selected initial findings. So we really have not looked at different geographic variation below a borough level. And for many of our statistics, we are still looking only citywide as one unified housing market. So the location or concentration of severely rent burdened households, obviously we did some early demographic analysis and presented the different types of New Yorkers that are disproportionately affected. And not surprising that we see that there are racial disparities. We also see disparities in terms of household composition and nativity. And these are critical regardless of the geographic concentration. But one of the things that we are always make sure that we're thinking about is households, and this certainly applies primarily to severely rent burdened households. We think about those who are in government assisted housing like Nycc or with a voucher, where those individuals' rents change with their incomes, what we call means tested housing, and think about that as a slightly different group than those who are renting other types of housing where the rent is set independent of their income. And really where we see that the severely rent burdened is, of course, in those other units that do not change when the household's income changes. And as with all rent burden, right, it is the result of two factors. It's incomes and the change in incomes. And of course, for the 2021 NYC HVS, we saw that incomes once again stagnated overall. But within that, there's obviously very divergent experience during the pandemic, beginning of the pandemic. And on the other hand is the change in rents over time, and how those two things intersect is what, right, is the calculation of whether someone is rent burdened or at what level. So going back to an earlier statement of the persistence of high levels of rent burden, which we've now seen going all the way back to 2011, it's important to note that that's the typical New Yorker, right? And certainly is not the experience of New Yorkers at the extremes. And too many New Yorkers obviously are facing severe rent burden, and or not rent burden, but struggling in other ways to make ends meet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And how will the HVS inform the mayor's housing plan? I mean, it seems like we have quite a number of data sources, the HVS being the freshest and newest. But we have the ACS, we have, of course, the 2020 census. And we also have, rich information and data from many of our CVOs or civics in the city. How does the mayor's housing plan, how will the mayor's housing plan borrow from not just the HVS, but these other sources of information, SHIP, ANHD's analyses, the Housing Conference, CSS, all of these organizations, LISC, UNHP that do so much work. How does that all sort of come together to inform the housing plan?
So I want to start by going back, because you asked a really good question about how we're thinking about policy and how the findings here are driving our policy. And I appreciate that question. It's the reason why Brendan and I are here today as well, because we take the findings of the NYC HVS really seriously, and it's going to help inform, right? We have this immediate obligation in front of us, as you've laid out very clearly, right? That the council is going to determine whether or not a housing emergency continues to exist for purposes of state law. But the NYC HVS provides us with this very rich amount of data that Liz has described in a lot of detail. And that's really important to inform our work. We know that researchers across the city, across the country also use this data, and how important the COVID module as sort of a basis for comparison over time is going to be really important. Both in sort of our regular policy, but also how we think about being prepared for for crises. And so when we think about New Yorkers who are experiencing this housing market and are negatively impacted by it, there are a huge swath of New Yorkers who are struggling, and we need to be using the full range of tools to address this wide range of circumstances and to really help New Yorkers navigate these difficult circumstances. Some of that involves sort of the everyday work that people think about HPD involved in, continuing to build and preserve affordable housing across the city, making sure that New Yorkers have the opportunity to choose the borough, the neighborhood, the house that is best for them. It also includes advocating for policies that continue to allow us to increase those housing opportunities. We also, beyond just creating and preserving new affordable housing opportunities, we have one of the largest Section 8 programs in the country, and this is one of the sources for stabilizing a lot of particularly low-income New Yorkers. And Liz talked about the fact that for those New Yorkers, they are means tested, and so their rent adjusts as their income changes. We're also in the process of administering emergency housing vouchers, which were allocated by the administration, the federal government as part of the American Recovery Plan. And that's a huge influx for us. We're also looking to enroll as many tenants as we can who are eligible for SCREE and DREE to help offset the rising cost for seniors and those with disabilities. So there are a number of ways and a number of tools. And for such a multifaceted and extreme crisis, we need to be using all of them. And you'll see that reflected in our work, in our plan ahead, and how HPD continues to address and respond to these findings.
Thank you, Commissioner. But do you integrate the actual findings from other organizations and other surveys? Sorry, I think Deputy Commissioner was about to jump in.
I can take a part of that question, but Lucy, also feel free to jump in as well. I wanted to also follow up. You had sort of mentioned, I think the second part of your question was also thinking about how do we incorporate this work or these findings into things like our upcoming housing plan. And I would say that that is a big focus of us, and certainly Liz and her team's work is that feedback loop of understanding what is happening in the market and what is happening in New York City, and then how does that affect how we think about our programs and how we think about our policies. And so things like refocusing our efforts on extremely low and very low income units, right, is a direct result of not just this HVS. Unfortunately, it's been a condition that we've seen persist for a number of cycles of the HVS. And so that's been an important tool for us to be able to shift somewhat deftly to make sure that we're trying to meet the demands of the market. It also helped to influence or to steer some of our affirmatively furthering fair housing sort of response to HUD through the Where We Live NYC process. And so there you can see a lot of the work from the HVS, and a lot of the findings there sort of manifest in how we talk about what needs to change and the historic patterns in New York City and how we can hope to address them going forward. And then I think your last question, sorry, I think we're doing these in piecemeal, but hopefully we've gotten all of them. We certainly do work with our partners and really love engaging with the other sort of not-for-profits and think tanks and academic researchers who get engaged with both the HVS data that we produce, but produce their own data and look at that to see how that can help shape our programs and policies. And so we are, as the policy and strategy team here, we are certainly willing, able, and ready, and very eager to sort of engage on all of those to sort of see how we can do better and continually try to serve New Yorkers in a better way.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I could go on forever, but I probably shouldn't. Just one more from me. And if my colleagues don't have additional questions, we can thank you for your time. But just sort of harkening back to the conversation about vacant units and why, does the HVS keep track of property owners who might be warehousing vacant units? It's something that we hear a lot from advocacy organizations and affected New Yorkers, that there are, you walk around or you go around the city and there are these places that just have been boarded up or have the darkened windows for years and years. How does the HVS treat those kind of units, and policy prescriptions? What can the city do about getting those back online into the market?
So let me take at least the first couple of those pieces, and then I can tag Brendan and Lucy to fill in at the end. So first of all, and this is true of all of the data we collect, it's important for everyone to understand that Those same federal privacy laws that protect privacy and confidentiality means that all of the information we collect for the NYC HVS it can only be used for statistical purposes. So first, I just want to make that clear that we don't create a sort of inventory of vacant units, right, or lists of building owners that then any kind of enforcement could happen. We don't collect and share information with other federal agencies related to immigration status, or right, or with even our own housing partners about who is an authorized occupant or not in any given unit. All of those things are important for us to be able to establish trust and rapport and get honest answers from our respondents. And obviously are critical to making sure that overall we can protect privacy and confidentiality through our work with the Census Bureau. So just wanted to help make that clear, and it's an important sort of facet of our disclosure avoidance principles as well. So we certainly have heard over the last several years about this issue of warehousing or mothballing units, units that are just not available for a variety of reasons, or for no apparent reason other than the choice of the owner. I defer to Brendan and Lucy on the policy side of that, but on the data side, we have been having conversations, hearing the importance of this issue over some time. And so for 2021, we added a classification, what we called held as vacant, which is not necessarily warehousing in all of the dimensions that you're describing it, but is at least one important piece of that, which is a unit that has been empty and vacant for 12 months or longer. We said was, even if we didn't have another reason that was provided to us of why that was the case, we said in New York City, in the market that we see with the demand that we see and saw even in the 2021 NYC HVS, that there is something about that unit that it is clearly not actually available for rent, or there is something about it that precludes somebody from being able to rent that unit at that time. So that is one step that we have taken toward keeping up with those conditions and key issues over time. We continue to review all of the methodology in the NYC HVS, both on the back end for the statistical validity of it, and on the front end for the validity, external validity, and the interpretability, making sure we're capturing data that are useful and timely. And that is one important piece that we thought was really critical for us to address at the beginning of this decade with this redesign.
And just to address the second part of your question, Chair, in terms of what we can do, from a legal perspective, it's, there's no law that prohibits owners from behaving in this way. And so we can't intervene from that perspective. But that said, as Liz mentioned, right, we can't necessarily attribute causation to any particular unit or to any particular building as to why they might be offline for some period of time. What we know anecdotally, not from the NYC HVS necessarily, but during the course of the pandemic, we know that a lot of buildings and a lot of building owners had to defer maintenance for some time just to make sure that their buildings could operate and they could sort of maintain their financing. And so to the extent that there are building owners, and again, just as fragmented and as wide and diverse the range of tenants are in New York City, so are the owners. And so on the preservation side of what we do in our work, we try to work with as many different types of building owners across the spectrum, from 1 to 4 family owners that need emergency repairs for their small home, to small building owners who want to do some sort of green repair work, or much larger building owners and portfolio owners that are really doing more substantial work across a larger swath. So we encourage owners that are having issues or having trouble keeping up with maintenance in their buildings to really reach out to us, and we can sort of work with them to figure out the right solutions to both improve the quality of their units and improve the quality of their buildings, but also to ensure that those tenants remain safe and stably housed.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. So we can't use it for enforcement or data sharing or anything like that, but we can use it de-individuated for policymaking purposes and to sort of inform the city's work.
Yeah.
Yes, and that is our mission, is to do exactly that and to provide data for people to be able to make evidence-based decisions and understand the current conditions and to be able to build better policies for our city.
Excellent. All right. Well, On that note, not seeing hands from my colleagues at this time, I just want to take a second to thank you, HPD and the census, who's not here, but thank you, HPD, for all of your work on the HVS, for your commitment to making sure that it is a process that is conducted with integrity, that we are getting good and correct and real information from it. I think that's the most important thing. You know, us as council members, you know, I'm in my office right now. I can't tell you how many people are out there, but it's been music and lots of people coming in and out all day. And the majority of what they're coming in for is affordable housing issues, housing quality. And so, you know, it's really important to be able to ground these experiences that we're having in our districts with statistically significant information and appropriate information. So I just want to thank you for doing that work on behalf of the city, and you know, look forward to having many more conversations, especially as the microdata comes out from HPD. So thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Brendan, and thank you, Lucy. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chair. We appreciate the time.
Okay. And the rest of the team, I know it's an army back there.
It is a small army, but we are a powerful one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to our committee counsel, Audrey Sun. Are there folks that are signed up for testimony?
Yes, thank you. We'll now turn to testimony from members of the public who are registered to participate. Just a quick reminder that you will be on mute until it's your turn to testify. I will call names periodically, so please listen and be prepared to accept the prompt to unmute when your time is coming up. And in the interest of time, testimony will be limited to 2 minutes per person. First, we'll hear from Mike McGee, followed by Chelsea Spencer and Ellen Davidson.
Time starts now.
Good morning. Good morning, Chair Sanchez and members of the committee, and thanks for the opportunity to testify about this very important issue. First, I want to thank Liz Gomer and her staff at HPD for doing a terrific job of a very important study in difficult conditions, as she's so ably described. I would also just like to mention what a pleasure it is to have a committee chair who understands these issues and can ask intelligent questions about it, because in past years, some of these hearings have been quite embarrassing. But if you look at the HVS over time, what it shows you is we have a loss of affordable housing and regulated units and a loss of affordability. In 1996, I remember rent stabilized units comprised 56% of the rental housing stock in the city. And according to the 2021 Housing and Vacancy Survey, we're now down to 44%. That is the trend we've had over time, and that's very been damaging to the housing situation in the city. I also want to just ask you to think in terms of the 5% trigger as being an arbitrary number. To my knowledge, no one's ever done a scientific study that demonstrated that if you have a vacancy rate, a net vacancy rate of 4.5%, you have a housing emergency. And if you have a vacancy rate of 5.5%, you don't. And if you stop and think about it, it doesn't really make sense. And there are rent laws in other parts of the country that do not have this vacancy rate trigger. They just treat rent regulation, rent and eviction regulation as something that is necessary as a public utility for the public good. I've submitted written testimony, which I won't read, but it calls for you, the council, to join us in a complete restructuring of the rent regulation system.
Time
It is
expired.
not enough. Just let me finish. It's not enough to renew these laws. We need to rethink them, and we want to work with you, this new city council, to come to a better system and to achieve these reforms that we need. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. McKee. Really appreciate you taking the time today and for the compliment. So I'll take it gladly.
Well, I gather you've studied this.
A little bit here and there.
Makes a difference.
It does, and it's something that a lot of us, including myself included, are really passionate about. but just to follow up on your ideas on restructuring the system, I mean, EarthStat does limit the city council's role in rent regulation and setting any legislation or any policy in this area. What do you have in mind? What are some of the ideas that you have in mind for restructuring?
I have a whole program. In fact, I've written legislation that would actually simplify and streamline the system while making it more protective of tenants. And I'd be happy to share that with you. I would start with, first of all, we should remember that the rent stabilization system was designed by the real estate industry itself. And for the first 15 years of its history, it was actually administered by the real estate industry through what we now know as the Rent Stabilization Association. The RSA was actually the enforcement and administrative agency that ran the system until the state legislature removed them, severed them from that role because of egregious misconduct over the years. Many of the worst features of rent stabilization and that original design have been corrected, but the way rent adjustments are handled, the Rent Guidelines Board is substantially the same. It's unchanged for the last 50 odd years. And when the new board votes on June 21st, I predict that rent stabilized tenants are going to be slammed with harmful rent increases. And a lot of this is because of things in the law that have not been changed that need to be looked at. I think it's time for the ERSTAT law to be repealed. I have actually opposed repealing the ERSTAT law in the past because until we could get a statewide system in place, I think it could have been divisive and politically damaging to have home rule return to the city. And I want to remind you that it was the New York City Council, not the state legislature, that first enacted permanent vacancy decontrol in 1994. Members of the city council don't know that or don't remember it, but it was you guys, or your predecessors to be exact, who actually imposed permanent vacancy decontrol on rent controlled and rent stabilized units. And we have lost, in my calculation, at least 300,000 apartments through vacancy decontrol, which we finally got repealed 3 years ago. But those 300,000 units were not restored to rent regulation. So those market rate tenants are sitting there unprotected at the mercy of their landlords. I think it's really time we started to push for home rule to be restored to the council, and things that we can't win in Albany, let's win them at the city council.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Fascinating. I did not know that the council did that in 1994. I would have been.
Jenny, Laurie, and I were there.
I was 6. No, that's really, really important context and history, and also a cautionary, example of, what can happen if political winds change and we have a different council in the future and we do restore home rule. But I think it's still certainly worth the conversation. Now, sorry, last question before we turn to others. 5% vacancy rate, absolutely, it's arbitrary, right? It's who knows where they pulled it from. But do you, from your estimation and thinking about this over the years, is there a number that would make sense for how we determine the state of emergency, or are you sort of a proponent of universal rent control and rent stabilization?
I believe that rent regulation should be treated as a public utility, just as we regulate the price of milk, which most people don't know. We should be regulating the price of rental housing for the public good. And I submit that even if you had a vacancy rate well in excess of 5%, which can be a temporary thing, vacancy rates rise and fall. This is certainly the highest it's been since 1965. But I want to remind you that in 1991, in the 1991 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the net vacancy rate was 4.1%, which at that point was the highest it had ever been. But I submit that at any vacancy rate, tenants need, and the housing market needs, stability, and people need protections from arbitrary eviction, and they need protections from excessive rent increases. So I would look upon and we actually introduced legislation in the state legislature back in the 1980s that would have essentially made the continuation of rent regulation a matter of public policy, treating it as a public utility, divorced from the vacancy rate. Unfortunately, that did not gain any traction and people weren't willing to look at it. Everybody thought, oh, well, it's too abstract an issue. I mean, you're stuck with 5%. It's in the statute. There's nothing, we can do at the moment about that. But I think as a matter of policy, it should be considered arbitrary. And there was a lot of fear, quite understandable, in the pandemic as Manhattan emptied out. And of course, the reason Manhattan emptied out is you have more affluent people in Manhattan who either have second homes or have the financial capacity to go somewhere else in a COVID pandemic, whereas people in your district were stuck, could not possibly go anywhere else, can barely, in many cases, afford to pay the rent that they have to pay now. So this was a blip in my view, and I think probably if you looked at it, if the HVS were done now, I think the vacancy rate would be significantly lower than 4.5%.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. McKee. Really, really appreciate your time and your testimony and for answering my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll now hear from Chelsea Spencer, followed by Ellen Davidson and Jenny Laurie.
Time starts now.
Hi, my name is Chelsea Spencer. Thank you so much for your attention today. I'm actually here on behalf of my tenants union, and there's 4 other members here. Would it be possible if we present it all together at the end?
Certainly.
Okay, and so 2 of us registered, but they didn't receive an invite link, so they're logged in under my name. Is that all right?
I'll follow up with you off the Zoom over email.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So we'll now turn to Ellen Davidson, followed by Jenny Laurie.
Good morning. My name is Ellen Davidson. I'm a staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society. And like some of the others on this call, this is not my first time testifying at this hearing. I think it's either my 4th or 5th. And so I work for the Legal Aid Society. We represent low-income tenants. And as you heard from the chief researcher, that rent stabilization is the largest source of low-cost housing in New York City. What the rent stabilization law says is that the primary purpose of rent regulation has been to eliminate abnormal rents in an overheated market. The rent stabilization law says its goal is to protect public health, safety, and welfare, and to present exactions of unjust and unreasonable and oppressive rental agreements. The findings of the law said that prior to the law passing, tenants were facing these increases, which created severe hardship to tenants of such accommodations, and were uprooting longtime city residents from their communities. In fact, you may hear from what we see in the news stories, similar rent spikes and similar unfair rental agreements that tenants on the unregulated market are finding. In our own practice, we see clients without the right to a renewal lease, which the rent stabilization law guarantees, complaining about repairs, facing retaliation for standing up for their rights. Rent regulation does both. It is both about ensuring that rent increases are fair, but it also allows tenants to become parts of communities. There's plenty of studies that have shown that stability in housing is good for families, it's good for health of a community, it is good for education achievement, and it enables low wage earners to maintain their employment. So we strongly support both of the pre-considered, the resolution and the intro, and extending the rent laws. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for testifying and for being active on this issue for 5 go-arounds. That's really great to have the perspective, your perspective. So one question that I have had over time, and I think that CSS did an initial analysis on this, was what difference has the HSTPA made, the 2019 Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act? How has that helped to further protect tenants? Any numbers that we can see? And, thinking about to Mr. McKee's points from earlier, moving forward, what have we learned, and where should we be taking rent stabilization? Where should the state consider taking rent stabilization from here?
So I will say that just from our experience representing thousands of tenants across the city, we have seen that the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act has already had great impact on our clients' lives, especially our clients who had preferential rents and who were also often facing rent spikes. Because it used to be if you had a preferential rent at each and every lease term, landlords could raise the rent as much as they wanted to. And so we had many clients who were afraid of requesting repairs in their apartments for fear that the landlords would take away their preferential rents. We've also, at the last time we did this hearing, one of the, or I should say, at the 2019 series of hearings that were held by the state legislature, HPD testified that with the various loopholes in the law, most apartments were about 2 vacancies away from deregulation. And that pressure to vacate apartments because there was such a windfall at the end of it was a pressure that was felt by certainly our clients and I think tenants across the city. And so definitely I think that one of the things that the HSTPA did was take some of the pressure off of long-term tenants with low rent apartments because their landlords don't get a reward for evicting them. Having said that, I do think that it is going to be difficult to tease out what the HSTPA did because COVID is such an intervening factor that a lot of how the market reacts and how landlord-tenant relationships work has been affected by the health emergency, the various moratoria that were put into place, and tenants, especially low-income tenants, incredible financial pressures that they were under during COVID, the loss of jobs, much of which have still not returned. And so, I'm very grateful that HSTPA was put in place before this crisis, but I do think it may be challenging to tease out all of the effects that we see. Yeah. As for where I'd like to see the rent stabilization law go, let me start by saying that the Legal Aid Society is co-counsel on 5 cases that landlords have to overturn the rent laws. All 5 were dismissed by the federal district courts. All 5 are currently in the Second Circuit, but the stated purpose of these cases is to get to our more radicalized conservative Supreme Court. The lawsuits both challenge the HSTPA as well as the ETPA. The arguments in the Second Circuit, the things that were attacked were tenants' right to a renewal lease, the right of tenants to succeed to leases, and the fact that the landlords have some regulation on how high they can increase the rents. So having said that, I think before we radically change the rent stabilization law, I'd like to get through these court cases. And then we can rethink and see where we are. But at the moment, we have to get through the Second Circuit, and then hopefully the Supreme Court will not take cert. And we will have the courts behind our rent laws, and then we can look ahead. That's where I see things. That's where I'm most comfortable at the moment.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. Really appreciate your time.
You got it. Thank you so much for having this hearing.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Jenny Laurie, followed by Richard McGuire and Danielle Mowry.
Time starts now.
Good morning. Thanks so much to Chair Sanchez for asking these great questions. It's really great to hear this debate or this the hearing, the testimony by the city, and the questions you've been asking have been terrific and really a breath of fresh air. My name is Jenny Laurie. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Court Answers, a nonprofit which provides support and legal information to tenants and landlords without attorneys from information tables in the city's housing courts and through a telephone hotline. Since January 15th, when the state moratorium expired, our hotline staff have been taking about 200 calls a day from New York City tenants who are facing eviction. From our perspective, rent stabilization is one of the most effective eviction and homelessness prevention programs in the city and should be continued. Much of our work is helping tenants living the housing emergency, those who are being taken to housing court for non-payment of rent and who had a temporary loss of income due to direct or indirect impact of the pandemic. Some callers are in holdover proceedings, facing eviction for something other than non-payment of rent. Most tenants facing holdover evictions who call our hotline, live in unregulated housing with expired leases or month-to-month tenancies, and most of them will have to move. Rent stabilized and rent controlled tenants have the right to stay in their apartments if they can pay the rent and obey the rules. These tenants are protected against precipitous and unexpected rent increases. They also have other protections that are really important. And as others have said, it's still the fact that rent-regulated housing stock provides the largest supply of affordable housing for low and moderate income tenants in the city, far outpacing Section 8 and Nycc housing. So the biggest benefit of rent stabilization is that it protects tenants from eviction and housing instability. Thank you very much. And whoa, look at that time.
There you go. Very nice.
Never done that before.
Very, very great. Thank you so much, Jenny, and nice to meet you. I think I've been calling Housing Court Answers for like 10 years, so appreciate everything that you all do.
Glad to support. Thank you.
Absolutely. Can you just one more time repeat for me the number of tenants that you have calling in per day?
Oh, so we're talking to about 200 callers a day. We get more calls than that, but about 200 calls a day since the eviction moratorium expired.
Got it. And calls that you don't take, is it just capacity?
Yes.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, thank you so much for the work that you do. It is a lifeline, and we really appreciate you in all of our offices. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We will now hear from Richard McGuire, followed by Danielle Mowry and Lyric Thompson.
Time starts now.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm actually part of the tenants group at the end. I would ask if I could be skipped over so I could join them at the end of the meeting.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Danielle Mowry.
Hello. Should I start now? Okay. Thank you again for holding this meeting, Chair and committee members. And I'm Danielle Mowry, and I've been active in housing advocacy for the past several years. And I've also been a New York City renter my entire adult life in the city. I currently live in a rent stabilized building in Bay Ridge, and I've had both rent stabilized and non-regulated living situations. And speaking from a personal perspective, the apartments that weren't rent stabilized included life-changing harassment from one landlord, a carbon monoxide leak unfixed for a month from another, and moves when new owners came in, and bought a building and nearly doubled my rent when I had a small child and had to move with a baby. When I first moved to New York City after college, I did the bouncing around, couch surfing, subletting, roommates, and all of that. And I finally had a rent stabilized apartment with a boyfriend in East Village. We felt like we really scored there. And our lives were pretty stable, and we were able to focus on building our lives for 5 years. And then we moved into Brooklyn in an unregulated apartment in an individually owned home. And I just want to delve into the personal there. Like, without getting into the details, we had such landlord harassment that my boyfriend at the time, who was a refugee, an immigrant, had moved here alone when he was 17, worked in a restaurant. He endured the brunt of it because my landlord would harass him during the day when he was trying to sleep, and all sorts of different things, and threaten us constantly with being moved out. And it ultimately led to him having anxiety and depression, and unfortunately, ultimately turning to drugs. He had a coke addiction. And so it was life-changing. I mean, it basically destroyed his life. It destroyed our relationship. And we did move out of the apartment. And so the stabilization, it's not just economics. It's also mental health issues. It's also about building a city and building a community. And today, when I look around, I hear a lot of this now: rents going up, next generation not being able to find apartments. And it's really—
Time expired.
if I could just finish the last thought. I just find that Sherrod Brown had said on a National Low Income Housing Coalition call that when you lose your home, everything starts to fall apart. And I would say a step further: when you lose the stability of feeling like you have a home that is going to remain your home, that you can constantly access and come to and recharge in, that's when everything starts to fall apart. And I don't think our city could afford to lose that small base of security, that shrinking base of security that we need for people to move ahead in their lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing your story and that perspective. It's really powerful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. We will now hear from Lyric Thompson.
Time starts now.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having this hearing. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share. Rent stabilization, I think, doesn't go far enough. DHCR is antiquated, and the system takes 2 to 6 years for simple complaints. But with regard to housing, we have to address the fact that we do have unscrupulous landlords that will jack up the rent $900 in a year, and this displaces people. There's a building across the street. It's a old building. The tenants have been there. One tenant has been in that building for 52 years, which blows my mind. Young couple, when they moved in, raised their family there. Well, now there's a new owner and he wants to eject them because they're rent stabilized. They have, lesser rent. So he is trying to actively get these people out. And he's been able to destabilize some of the units and force some of these tenants out. And it's disgusting. We need stronger laws. We need stronger enforcement. And something that strikes me is that we regulate every other business. I couldn't paint your toenails as the chair of housing without a license, because God forbid I cut a cuticle. Now you can't walk, your toes jacked up. I'm responsible for that. Yet we don't license those that manage and provide housing. Why? I mean, there should be standards. And so when it comes to licensure, stabilization would be part of that. We need to regulate the business and completely regulate the business. I wanted to also, in closing, briefly touch on the bills that you passed the other day or last week regarding self-closing doors, fire-rated equipment, and things of that sort. I've been fighting with HPD for 7 years over our doors. We're in a 421A building that was never really completed and fraudulently signed off, so we've never had code-compliant doors. HPD does not know the standards that they're supposed to enforce.
Time expired.
HPD does not train their inspectors in the NFPA codes that govern those doors. As I'm testifying to you right now, I have non-code compliant doors that HPD refuses to write violations for because DOI says they're fine. Yet on the other side of that, DOB development, NFPA Northeast Regional Training Chief, Robert Duvall, Roger Skoll, an AHC expert, DOB plan exam, universal fire door, NFPA tech support, you can call them with questions regarding the code, and the fire department all tell me that my doors will fail in the event of a fire. We need to do better. The class is an hour and a half and cost about $200. Now I'll crowdsource it if I have to, but I can't help but think that we already have the resources to address this type of issue. And that's all I have to say. Thank you for allowing me the time, and I hope you guys have a nice day. Anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lyric. And thank you for being in touch with our office. I think we have developed a whole new relationship with you, which we appreciate. No, I did want to thank you for first of all speaking on the HVS. I think it's a great idea, and would love to hear your ideas for what would go into licensing if we were to think about a scheme like that.
I've already written a law. I will forward it to you.
Excellent, thank you. And then on the self-closing doors issue, we are aware. We have been in touch with you. A few council members, I won't name them here, and I are working together on a letter that will be going to HPD, DOB, FDNY. There does need to be increased coordination. It's not acceptable for agencies to disagree on very essential life-saving interventions. And so thank you for your advocacy on behalf of your building, on behalf of yourself. We will be looking into it, and we'll be circling back to you very soon.
Thank you.
Of course.
Great, thank you very much. We will now hear from Chelsea Spencer, followed by Bryant Wells and Kelsey Fairhurst.
Time starts now.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today, and for your attention to something of a particular issue concerning our building. My neighbors and I are here today on behalf of the Opera House Lofts Tenants Union, which represents 26 units and over 50 residents. And we'd like to talk about an issue concerning the converted loft building we live in at 27 Arian Place in Bushwick. We've prepared a shared testimony that we'd like to read in 5 2-minute pieces. So specifically, we are here today to ask for your support in persuading the Department of Buildings to conduct a full inspection of our building, which they neglected to do when they recently issued a residential certificate of occupancy for our address, thus blocking our application for loft law protection, which we submitted in 2020. To explain why an inspection is necessary, we will tell you about the recent history of our building and our concerns about its safety and habitability. Our landlords own 40 multi-unit buildings across Brooklyn and Queens, including many converted loft buildings. In the early 2000s, they bought and began converting our building, which is a historic choir hall, into rental apartments. And for this project, they hired an architect who has a notorious history with the DOB for failing to comply with building codes. And so based on this history and our own lived experience here at 27 Arian Place, we know that our landlords cannot be trusted to address the safety and habitability issues here and at their other buildings. And so my neighbor, if possible, we kind of planned a trade-off thing. Could Sylvie Wise testify next?
Sure.
Sorry for the choreography. Thank you very much.
Sure. We'll now turn to Sylvie Wise.
Hi, thank you guys for your flexibility and for letting us speak here today. And thank you, Chelsea, for that introduction. My name is Sylvie Wise. I've been a resident at 27 Arian Place since 2020. And to pick up where Chelsea left off, fire safety is our #1 concern. We have been feeling particularly fearful about these issues in our building following the horrifying news of the Bronx apartment fire earlier this year. This deadly tragedy was the result of 2 building maintenance issues, cold indoor temperatures and a broken self-closing door mechanism. Our building is full of similar issues, including insufficient fire protection on wood joists, illegal heating units, illegal mezzanines, lack of proper egress, and indeed many doors that do not self-close. Not only would these conditions in combination prove deadly in the event of a fire, they also make a fire more likely. In April of this year, the FDNY confirmed our fears when they issued several Class 1 or immediately hazardous fire code violations for non-compliant sprinklers and dangerous problems with heater ventings and valves. In addition, our landlords have neglected to maintain the building in ways that impact our daily lives. These issues have been left to fester for many years, but in recent months, our landlords have performatively responded to violations issued by the DOB and FDNY by rushing to fix cosmetic issues throughout the building. Meanwhile, the more serious issues remain unaddressed. My neighbor, Richard McGuire, will now elaborate on loft law application process, and we hope that you all will consider holding the DOB accountable for the safety of our building.
Richard McGuire.
Hi, thank you, council members, for listening to me speak today. My name is Richie McGuire, and I've been in 27 Arion Place since 2009. Now, please bear with me because in my public speaking class in college, I apparently switched accents, and this is quite scary for me, but here we go. In 2020, I joined my neighbors in applying for loft law protection, hoping that the process and the oversight of the municipal agencies would ensure that the issues in our building would be addressed. We were not surprised when the landlord opposed our efforts. What was surprising and extremely disheartening was that the DOB worked against us, choosing instead to cooperate with our landlord in an attempt to invalidate our right to seek loft law protection. By taking advantage of the DOB's confusing and inconsistent record for our building. When we submitted our loft law application, the DOB had no residential certificate of occupancy for a file on our building, located at 1127 Arion Place. Next door to our building, there is a small vacant lot, 9 Arion Place. It was for this address of this vacant lot in 2005, the DOB granted a CO for 70 apartment hotels. Even if we assume, and we do not, that the issuance of this CO for the wrong address, the wrong lot number, and the wrong bin was simply, as our landlords have claimed, an innocent clerical error, there are other inconsistencies in the descriptions in the CO and alteration filings that can be reconciled neither with the characteristics of the building that was built in 1886 as a choir hall, nor with the building that stands today as our home. These concern not only the height of the building and the number of stories. These concern not only the height of the building and the number of stories, but also far more worrying, the construction classification based on fire resistant ratings. My neighbor will elaborate on our attempts to communicate with the DOB. Thank you for considering and asking the DOB to conduct a full inspection of our building. And I hope I didn't change accents. Thank you. My neighbor, Kelsey, will now take over.
Thanks very much. We will now hear from Kelsey Fairhurst, followed by Bryant Wells.
My name is Kelsey Fairhurst, and I've lived in the building for 8 years. Our attorney has sent multiple letters to the DOB providing substantial details about the building's non-code compliance. As tenants, we too have made several attempts to communicate directly with the DOB about the issues of our building, requesting inspections and meetings. The DOB has completely ignored all of them. In February of this year, we organized a walkthrough of our building and our units. We invited elected officials, their staff, and the DOB. The DOB declined to attend. We have only once received an official response from the DOB regarding our complaints. It was a cryptic letter saying that our complaints had been administratively closed prior to inspection. We suspect this was to avoid oversight. Ignoring our concerns, the DOB instead cooperated with our landlord in asking the Kings County Supreme Court to order a residential CO issued for the vacant lot adjacent to our building to be transferred to our address. Deferring to the DOB's authority and accepting our landlord's claim that the address listed was a typo, the judge declared the CO retroactively valid for our address. Never during this nearly 2-year process was an inspection of the building completed. Had such an inspection been carried out, there is no legal way that a CO, which is a document that is supposed to confirm the building complies with the law, could have been issued or transferred to our building. Bryant Wells will elaborate on the CO issue, and I hope you will consider asking the DOB to conduct a full inspection of our building.
Bryant Wells.
Hi, my name is Bryant Wells. Thank you all for your time today. Yeah, my name is Bryant, and I've lived in this building since I want to say like 2005 or 2006. And so just picking up from where Kelsey left off. Yeah, so the legal fiction of this transferred C of O thus papers over a reality that we tenants must live with every day, regardless of the address. The Opera House Lofts building is patently neither safe nor code compliant. The C of O, which we know is invalid, also blocks our right to loft law protection. And we have every reason to believe that the loft law is the only recourse that we have to protect our rights to safe, stable, and affordable housing. To distract from the real issues at play, our landlords have repeatedly accused us of trying to take advantage of what they say is nothing more than a typo. Given our landlords' documented history of finding remarkably inventive ways to skirt laws that were designed to protect New Yorkers in our building and other buildings around the district, and the DOB's documented history of being willing to look the other way, we find this excuse preposterous. The so-called typo is a red herring. The real issues we are here to speak about are our rights as loft tenants, community members, New Yorkers, and human beings to safe, stable housing. Our landlords' desire to continue to profit from the neglect of tenants throughout Brooklyn, and the DOB's willingness to aid them in pursuing this desire. If the DOB had not gone out of its way to cooperate with the landlords while refusing to even acknowledge our concerns about the safety and habitability of our building, we would now have loft law protection. So yes, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for considering our case and just hearing our story. And hopefully you can encourage the DOB to conduct a proper inspection of our building and buildings like it across New York.
Well, thank you so much. Was that the full list?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. And just one follow-up question: what are the sort of rights and protections that loft law would afford you all?
So any other members could chime in and expand on this, but basically the loft coverage under loft law would require the landlord to fix the issues and code violations that presently exist, and provide rent stabilization or during that time period until those changes are made.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you for bringing this to our attention. I would certainly, push you all to also make this known to the Department of Investigation. There is an Inspector General for the DOB. If you have not already done so, please do submit to them so they can look into the matter. And if you can follow up with our office, we'll be looking out for your written testimony. But if you could email us district14@council.nyc.gov with more information, we would be happy to look into it. Okay.
Great, thank you so much.
Great, thanks very much. I believe this now concludes the public testimony. If we have inadvertently forgotten to call on anyone, please use the Zoom raise hand function now and we'll hear from you. All right, seeing no hands, I will turn it back over to Chair Sanchez to close the hearing.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Audrey. Thank you to everyone who has participated today, to members of the administration, to members of the public. Thank you for the time that you have committed to make your issues known and to especially talk about the housing vacancy survey. This is a very important hearing. This is a hearing to talk about the methods and really the integrity of the way that the survey was conducted, because we need to, as a council, base our determination on the integrity of the survey, right? A good survey showing a vacancy rate of lower than 5% allows us to continue rent stabilization. And so it's very important that we were able to ask many questions and have those answered by the administration as representatives of, doing that joint work that happened between HPD and the Census Bureau. So again, I just want to thank everyone. I look forward to further discussion on the findings following this hearing. As you all have heard time and again, the administration should be releasing the housing plan very shortly, which was informed by the housing vacancy survey. And that's really where we get to dig in on the policy, the importance of rent stabilization to New Yorkers, what more we can be doing to strengthen policy via the City of New York to protect renters. So step one, make sure we have a good survey and make sure it's saying what it needs to say in order to continue the state of emergency. And with that, then we can talk about further policy issues in the City of New York. So thank you all so very much. Audrey, thank you for all your work. Jose and Charles, thank you, policy analysts for the committee. Appreciate your time and energy. Sergeant? Excellent. Now this hearing is adjourned.